You in there!
Documented cases of demon possession and exorcism in recent history.
Something was coming from underneath those stairs that was causing the whole house to turn.
Gary, Indiana, a small suburb of Chicago ridden with poverty, violence, and gang activity. This is where our story starts. Sitting in Gary, Indiana, resides a small home that would turn to be a literal portal to hell. In 2012, the events of Latoya Ammons captured national attention. Ammons and her family claimed that demons haunted their home, and they enlisted the help of a priest to rid the home of the spirits. It became one of the most widely talked about paranormal events in all of history, but to fully understand it in context, we need to go back to the beginning. The Ammons family moved into a small rented house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana in the fall of 2011 with Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rose Campbell, and Latoya's 3 children. Almost a month after moving into the house, Latoya and her family began experiencing strange happenings. They suddenly found themselves infested by black horseflies on their screen and porch, which seemed oblivious to the freezing temperatures. Despite Latoya's attempts to swat insects with flypaper, the infestation persisted. Other events followed one after another. Almost simultaneously, after midnight a few times, Rosa and Latoya reported hearing footsteps climbing the basement stairs and a creak from the basement to the kitchen door. Fearing someone had broken in, they waited and waited for the worst. After a while, Latoya finally decided to step out, turn on the lights to inspect, only to find nobody there at all. Locks were even put on the doors to ensure no possible break-in could happen, and it was still happening. Their sounds would range from pounding on the door to animal growls and scratching. Rosa later saw a shadowy figure of a man pacing back and forth in her living room. In response to her fear of an intruder, she lay there paralyzed in bed until morning. Then investigated. The family found large wet footprints on the living room floor, despite the doors and windows being locked from the inside. Nothing made sense. It only gets much worse. Tragedy had struck the family on March 10, 2012. The Ammons family was up late due to death in the family. The friends were over, comforting the family, keeping them company, and an unseen force dragged Latoya's daughter off the couch, and after that, one of the boys was thrown into a freezer next to the living room. A short time later, as the children were lying in bed, they were suddenly interrupted by a piercing cry coming from the girl's room, where she was sleeping with her cousin. Concerned, Rosa stormed to the room to inspect the noise source to find her daughter dropping to the bed. She was levitating in the air, according to the cousin. Friends and family began to avoid this house at all costs, knowing a dark presence lingered about. The local churches, Latoya and Rosa, begged for help, turned a deaf ear to their pleas, believing the women were fabricating their tales or imagining. This is when the possession of Latoya's family truly began. Her and her 3 children, ages 8, 9, and 12, finally, after a particularly heartbreaking visit to a tiny community church, a minister declared the house to be haunted and that spirits indeed overtook it. The priest recommended thoroughly cleaning the entire house with bleach and ammonia. Then, they were to inscribe crosses on every door and window. Latoya and her mother also sought the help from additional sources. 2 clairvoyants had informed Latoya and her mother that the house was infested with demonic spirits, 200 of them to be exact. The power source of these demons was emanating from down in the basement. They are to remove the children from the house as soon as possible to protect them from harm's way. Out of desperation and nothing else more that she could do, she was told to make a makeshift altar in the basement consisting of pure white candles to represent holiness and a statue of the Holy Family. She also went through the entire house with a sage stick, burning it and reading from scripture. Psalms 91, praying for protection from God. After blessing every portion of the house, she made it back to the basement and placed the Bible right under the altar, open to Psalms 91. Unbelievably, for a short time, the family had experienced zero activity. They thought they had found peace. However, this is when things began to escalate as they had agitated the demons in the house by doing this. The demons in this home went out to Latoya and possessed her and her 3 children as well. The possession and overtaking of her children didn't seem consistent, but would appear to come and go at times. They had all the makings of acting possessed, eyes rolling in the back of their heads, gruff talking, faces changing, cryptic chants and phrases, and besieged by this unseen fatigue plaguing them. Seeing these children being physically tormented was awful for Latoya. Each child was affected differently. The youngest of her children began talking about what it would be like to die with a new imaginary friend who resided inside the closet. Then, her 9-year-old began talking about the feeling of being murdered, slowly and painfully, very dark, very morbid. Her oldest is 12 years old. Her daughter kept hearing voices tormenting her and telling her she would die, as would her family. Physical attacks also ensued against the entire family in the house. For instance, her daughter was battered against the headboard, causing a gash to her head, requiring stitches. There were other attacks too, like her children being thrown out of rooms by a potent, unforeseen force. Things began to get so bad that the family sought refuge in hotel rooms just so they can get a peaceful night of sleep, dreading going back to that house. Entirely out of desperation, Latoya sought the help of a physician who seemed completely petrified by her story and what she was describing. However, he wrote down mass hysteria, delusions, and hallucinations. Her mental health was his most significant concern, and not spiritual demonic manifestations. The doctor and medical staff would get their real first taste of the demonic realm. On a doctor's visit, going by verbal testimony to staff that appeared there at the time, the 2 boys began acting strange, cursing at the staff and doctor, growling in deep, low voices. The one boy is even being lifted and thrown against a wall in front of everybody by an unknown force. Both boys also fainted. Panic-stricken and confused, 911 was called, where the boys were taken to the hospital. Doctors and staff present mocked and scoffed at Latoya's stories, only to see that the one little boy of hers seemed to need to be held down by 5 grown men. At this point, CPS got involved. CPS worker Valerie Washington arrived at the hospital to interview the family and examine the children to ensure they were okay. During the interview, the caseworker was growled at and nearly attacked. He got increasingly violent and attempted to choke out his older brother before being restrained. Suspicions arose that the children were performing to align with Latoya's story, so the children were then isolated and brought into an exam room with a grandmother and a nurse. The youngest son began growling and yelling, thrashing about, and going crazy, turning to his brother, telling him, "It's time to die." The older brother became increasingly violent, ramming his head into his grandmother's stomach. Rosa, the grandmother, desperate and unsure of what to do next, just grabbed his hand and began to pray. This was when the older boy had a strange look come over his face and began to walk back up the wall to the ceiling, gliding across over to his grandmother and to land again on his feet, a disturbing display of supernatural power. The grandmother and nurse who were present were so shaken that they both ran out of the room in fear. Rosa was convinced, but an evil spirit controlled her grandson and the entire family. Within days after the events that had just taken place, a caseworker had come into Latoya's home to inform her they were taking her children into protective custody and were considered under spiritual and emotional distress under her care. This devastated Latoya and her children, but what was final was final. While the family had spent time at the hospital, the chaplain had become aware of the case and reached out on April 20th, 2012, to a Michael Maginot, the priest of Martyr Parish in Merrillville. His request was an exorcism for the boy. Maginot proceeded to visit the family after the request, but remained skeptical. On April 22nd, he had seen the home in question. His advice was simple: to rule out any natural causes for what was happening so they would know for sure this was demonic activity. He interviewed them for the following hours and listened to the entire history of paranormal activity at this home. However, during his visit to the house, paranormal activity ensued. There are shadows, wet feet prints developing on the floor out of nowhere, and window blinds swaying. During the same visit, Latoya began complaining of a headache and appeared to be aversive to holy objects. When Michael placed a crucifix upon her forehead, she began to convulse uncontrollably, and it was clear that whatever demonic entity was controlling this household also had a strong grip on Latoya. That day ended, and Maginot, leaving convinced this family was living in a demon's den, and believed there were other evil entities in the house. During his time there, he had gone room to room, blessing each hallway and room with holy water, reading Bible passages as he moved around the house. He strongly encouraged Latoya and her mother to leave the house and never return. Not even 1 week later, Latoya and her mother, a case manager, and 2 police officers who accompanied her were sent to investigate the home's condition. After a thorough inspection of room to room, they found nothing out of the ordinary, and that all changed very quickly. The basement, where they discovered directly underneath the stairwell, was completely unfinished. So unfinished that it was merely a dirt floor with no concrete poured in. This was very strange. The concrete all around it was jagged, as if it had appeared broken, like it was not developed that way or had been removed at a future time since development. Latoya herself admitted that she believed the demonic activity seemed to originate from that same patch of dirt. Considering that under there is where the demons are coming through, there's a portal down there. The experience in this Gary home was so intense that one of the Gary police captains now believes in demons after visiting this house. During that same visit, these officers had experienced strange noises and recordings picked up on their audio recorder that was not there originally during their walkthrough, as done by Lieutenant John Gruska, Lake County PD. Upon listening back to the playback of the tape, there was speech present that was not there originally. Both officers also reviewed footage and photography from that same day in the basement where the stairs were, only to find cloudy white images in all the upper right-hand corners. After zooming in, there appeared to be demonic faces in the clouds. The police captain had also taken pictures with his cell phone, which had strange black silhouettes in them. His personal vehicle and his police-issued vehicle began to have severe mechanical problems that could have caused a very bad accident. Interestingly, in April of 2012, there was a petition granted by the Lake Juvenile Courts to allow temporal wardship of all 3 Latoya's children. According to an investigation, Latoya neglected to enroll her children in school consistently. The youngest of her children was sent to live in a psychiatric care center where he was believed to be coherent and cognitively functional. The odd thing was his obsession with talking about demons. The psychologist firmly thought this was not a possession case, but rather delusion. Latoya, the mother of all 3 children, used the power of suggestion and influence to convince her children that demonic entities possessed them and the entire family. However, Latoya's oldest daughter told the psychologist that she witnessed tall shadow figures in the streets and house, and even went into multiple trances. She also details the strange paranormal happenings all around the home. One of the stipulations that the Department of Children's Services set included having no discussions of demons or being possessed, and seeing a therapist regularly. Latoya was also ordered to find other housing and work. On May 10th, 2012, Latoya, Rosa, and 3 police officers from the initial visit returned to the house. Priest Maginot and 2 Lake County officers with a police dog to try and determine if a body was present. At this time, a separate DCS caseworker was called out to the house because the other one was so traumatized by what had happened that she refused to go back. This woman dealt explicitly with horrific child abuse cases and was desensitized to that dark nature of the human condition. However, the incidents featuring the Ammons were so disturbing that they caused her to not go back and to transfer. One of the sergeants was dispatched to the house because 2 or 3 children were not attending school. He noted that there was a crucifix, burnt candles, and open Bibles everywhere you turned entering. He claimed it felt eerie. Now, Rosa, Latoya, and the 3 officers from the initial visit returned to the demon house. With everybody but the priest going down to the basement, they saw a peculiar substance that looked oily, dripping from the wall with no visible signs of where it came from. The texture of the oil or liquid felt weird, and Maginot instructed police to investigate the dirt under the staircase for either occult items or human remains. What's interesting is right around this time frame, the only link that could be suspected being behind the strange demonic activity in the house would be that somebody had placed a cursed object. It just so happens that her boyfriend at the time, whom she was no longer seeing, was secretly married. She did not know this when she saw him and received an angry phone call from his wife, who informed her that she would be very sorry that she ever messed with her husband. And throughout the relationship, several items from around her house had begun disappearing. For magic practitioners, using an object, A personal object from an individual is generally what you would use to put a curse on someone. The theory at the time that her boyfriend and/or his wife was into the occult was never proven, but if so, that he or she was placing a curse on the property. The police down in the basement dug 4 feet into the dirt to find strange objects. Thankfully, no body parts, pentagrams, or cursed objects. Instead, they found a press-on pink fingernail, a pair of children's socks, a metal bar, and a pair of women's panties. There was also speculation that the metal bar could have been used at one point or another to murder, or had some sort of connection with another death in the house. This is because the little boy had an imaginary friend who claimed to have been killed in that house. A record, at least 3 people have died in that house since its construction. While that was going on downstairs, upstairs, Latoya began to complain of deep migraine pain in her head. The caseworker who had touched the liquid, which she also saw in the cabinet, began to complain of an intense pain in her finger and hand. All the blood had also drained out of her hand after touching that liquid, and her hand felt tingly as if constricted. She began having a severe panic attack and left. It is believed that whatever was in the house attached itself to her, as within 30 days after her visitation to this residence, she endured a skiing accident that broke 3 ribs, got third-degree burns from a motorcycle, she broke her hand while hitting a table, and broke her ankle while out on a run. Also, the home inspector, after returning home from this house visit, a tree nearly fell on his car, almost crushing him alive, choked by an unseen force while sleeping, and developed cancer soon after. It seems anyone who visits this house is simply not safe. The police captain and the other officer also noticed the strange liquid substance appearing in the middle of the blinds in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Perplexed by their findings, they wiped it off and put a Q-tip at the base of the door to ensure that nobody else would come in or could, without alerting them, and potentially putting more oil on the blinds. Suspecting if Latoya or Rosa were messing with them, they would catch it. 40 minutes later, they had returned to the blinds soaked and dripping in this mysterious oily liquid, and nobody had entered the room. They had also inspected the outside, the ceiling, and other miscellaneous areas for any possible explanation of the liquid source, none of which were ever found. This spooked the officers. Maginot informed the officers that this liquid substance signifies a physical, demonic manifestation of possession. Knowing this, he had to act very quickly. As Officer Austin Charles is leaving, he's about 1.5 miles away from the house at this point and pulls into a parking lot into a gas station. And his FM/AM radio suddenly turns to static while he's communicating with another officer. And it says in this deep, demonic voice,
"You in there?"
Maginot had arranged to perform a series of powerful blessings on the house and perform a minor exorcism on Latoya. The case manager and 2 officers attended the exorcism rite, during which the caseworker claimed to feel something unseen in the room. After this, Maginot sought Bishop Dale Melzick's permission to perform an official exorcism on Latoya Ammons. His request was granted immediately, and the exorcism had commenced. Latoya was also instructed to find the names and identities of the demons responsible for inflicting her and her children, since it is essential to call out the names of the demons during the exorcism process. While researching these names, Latoya experienced technical malfunctions, dizziness, and nausea. It's almost as if something did not want her to find those names. But she did. The whole process would take 3 exorcisms. The first 2 were in English, and the final being in Latin. Both police officers decided to offer emotional support to Latoya and her family during the first couple of exorcisms. Latoya fought, she became violent and convulsed, and even fell unconscious at times. The demonic hold over her seemed to lessen after the second exorcism. The final exorcism came in June of 2012, where the ritual would appear to be successful, with only minor convulsions and resisting taking place. Latoya was now possession-free, and shortly after this, Latoya had moved from that wretched house to Indianapolis and would regain full custody of her children in the fall of 2012. The nightmare was not over yet. Sometimes, post-paranormal events of an entity or a demon can attach itself to an individual, like a priest in this case, for example. While nothing necessarily attached itself to Maginot, something interesting did happen near the end of the exorcism. Their parish had several storms come through at that time. One was right after Mass on Saturday, and it was so powerful it knocked out all the lights in the building. Thankfully, they came back on shortly thereafter. Latoya was convinced a demon was trying to lift her in the air, but could not muster the power because they were in a church, but the lights did go out during this time. And finally, a powerful storm came in that knocked the power out of the church for a whole day. Around 30 hours, actually. This would happen 2 other separate times where the power would go out entirely by storm, and the mass had to be candlelit the entire time. This never happened before ever. While the horrific events surrounding the Ammons family seemed to end for the time being, a new chapter was about to unfold as the family's story was made into The Demon House. Featuring Zach Bagans, star of the Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures, the documentary centers around Bagans' investigations into the family's claims. He purchased the house where the events occurred in Gary, Indiana for $35,000 in 2014. Supposedly, Zach had this nightmare before buying the house that there's this 8-foot-tall goat demon that's very high on the demon scale in terms of ranking in Satan's army, meaning it's a mighty demon that has much power. Zach also had admitted the bizarre events and circumstances surrounding the filming and production of this documentary, like technical malfunctions, crew and production teams getting very sick randomly, people refusing to show up, crew members and staff members just quitting randomly, etc. He personally believes the film is cursed. Zach had tried to reach out to Latoya for commentary, but she refused to be a part of it because the entities would attach themselves back to her again, or so she feared. Her brother Robert was willing to talk and afterwards was refused entry back into their home for the same reason. He made some very interesting and bold claims himself, talking about how the kids would show weird demonic behavior, strange chanting and growling and talking about death all the time, and a very peculiar growling, eyes rolling in the back of their heads, and attacking each other violently. Latoya's mother even recounted how her granddaughter would have episodes where she was saying that she can't take it anymore. The things these beings are saying to her in her head. Her grandson rolled his head around, talking in a deep voice, an evil voice, saying, "I came here to kill, and I'm going to kill." But even with all this evidence on display, there are some holes in the entirety of the story. The first is that Zach has visited the property's landlord for the last 10 plus years, and even he admits that he was unaware of any strange paranormal-esque activity happening. There was also a newspaper article dated from February 15th, 2014, with the headline, "Grandmother of Possessed Kids Insists None of This Went On." In the article, she details that none of what you heard is true, and it's damaging her family name. Bizarre, considering Latoya's mother, Rosa, is the one that lived in the house, witnessed all the events, and did interviews stating that she saw the kids being lifted. Oh, and there's also this supposed ghastly figure in the window that was determined to be made by a phone app. While digging deeper in the house, it turned out to have ample amounts of black mold in the attic and carbon monoxide leaking from the furnace from the chimney, which could cause a person to feel things. Could this explain it all away? And then we have Mika, a girl who lived in the house when she was a teenager in the 90s. Zach convinces her and her kids to come into the house to check it out. She explains that she would have terrible dreams about somebody close to her dying, when only months following, her brother, who lived in the basement at the time, was shot and killed. She stated to Zach that she hated going in the basement, and that is the reason why. On February 20th, 2014, just 2 days after Mika and her kids visited the house, her daughter attempted suicide by overdosing on medication and stabbing herself. Following this incident, one of the crew members also quits immediately. Mika, the mother, details how her daughter became someone else, threatened to kill her own mother. During the shoot as well, Zach and his crew take notice of a black mass that appears on camera for a slight moment in time and eventually enters into the cameraman, where he begins acting strange, almost possessed. Later on, back at the hotel, he began to turn violent and vomit blood and start screaming, becoming completely inconsolable, claiming he's seeing demons in the elevator. Zach claimed that he had changed permanently after the production of this documentary. And speaking of changing permanently, during this production, a good friend of Zach's was killed in a murder-suicide by her boyfriend. The circumstances are just so bizarre and dark. And finally, Zach decides to pull an all-nighter while the house is completely boarded up, every window and every door. His crew and police officers call him crazy for this. During his night alone in this house, completely boarded up and nowhere to go, has an encounter with this demon that causes him permanent eye damage and pain. He claims he is scarred from the making of this documentary and he would not be the same. Finally, to put an end to all the nightmares, Zach had the entire house bulldozed in hopes that the evil that resided there would never return. There have been reports since from neighbors saying that people will still show up on the plot of land at night and perform rituals and other satanic activity. Could Zach's add-on investigation story just be a quick cash grab fiction documentary? Pulling from the credibility of the eyewitnesses and the events of a real story to add credibility to his own film? That's for you to decide. One thing is for sure, the eyewitnesses and individuals who experienced trauma in some way from this great series of events don't believe it's fiction. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you smack that like button, leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I got a bunch of great juicy content that I think you guys are really gonna like coming down the pipeline. Stay tuned.